good morning and a very warm welcome to the Andrew Eborn Show. And I'm delighted that Christmas has come early. My wife gave me a very early Christmas present, which is The White Ship by Charles Spencer. And I'm delighted that 7 times writer, as well as winner of 2 Sunday Times Best Author and Best Book, Charles Spencer is joining me now. Good morning, Charles. How are you?
I'm very well, Andrew, thank you. I'm glad your wife has such fine taste.
Oh, fantastic taste. And she is so delighted because we love Game of Thrones, we love Titanic. It's that beautiful fusion of both. And yet you argue in the book that it's actually far more important than the Titanic. Why is that?
I think that's a fair case to make, really, because, of course, I'm not belittling the trauma of the Titanic and how appalling it was and what a great sort of piece of history it still is. I mean, that is incontrovertible. But the White Ship, which I have to confess isn't nearly as famous, probably had much greater impact because when it sank exactly 900 years ago, actually, at the end of 1120, it effectively brought to an end the Norman dynasty. So because of the White Ship, there are lots of ramifications, but one of the main ones was ultimately a very vicious civil war, which meant that the Plantagenets came to the throne, and yeah, they stayed there until they were unseated by the Tudors over 300 years later, and it's all because of a shipwreck in the Channel.
And it's quite extraordinary. What I love about the way that you write is it's not just dry facts and regurgitation of information. You write like a real thriller, a popular historian. Is that a fair way of describing you?
Well, it's certainly what I try to do. You know, I used to write, I used to work as a reporter for the one of the American networks for a long time. And I was always taught to write to picture. So what I'm trying to do, yes, I hopefully get the facts straight. But at the same time, I'm trying to drive a story and make people interested. And, you know, I write for a more general reader. This is not for academics, although I hope they'll enjoy it. I'm trying to tell a true tale. You mentioned I've written 7 books. I try and find a subject or a person who I think has been wrongly forgotten by history, who is box office, really. And so I hope it's not a commercial approach. It's very much one that's driven by the story at the heart of it. And that's what I try and bring alive.
Yeah, and I think what's great about you have 2 hooks, don't you? One is the big anniversary, as you say, 900 years, virtually to the day, back in November this year. Same as you did with Blenheim, that was tied into an anniversary. But also your central characters are just so good. Henry I, I mean, come on.
He's fantastic. You know, he's a wrongly forgotten great king of England. Yes, he was pretty unpleasant to people who crossed him, but if you didn't do that as a king in medieval times, you would end up dead yourself. But he was a fantastic king in so many ways. You know, if you judge by the period where he ruled, they said that a young girl could walk from one end of England during his rule with a purse full of gold and be left unmolested. Well, this was rare in the Middle Ages, and people valued him for his strong kingship. He was also very canny. You know, he didn't bother with aristocrats particularly. I mean, he had to deal with them and control them. But he brought in a new system of what we would call meritocracy, and people at the time wrote that he brought people up from the dust to the highest level of power. He did this because he was clever. He knew he could rely on their loyalty much better than somebody with an entitled past. And at the same time, he is the king who gave us the exchequer, for better or worse.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he's done it all.
Absolutely. And talk about done it all. I mean, one of the reasons he was so effective and people could feel so safe, it was a reign of terror, wasn't it? I mean, we talk about castrations and blindings. It's horrendous, isn't it?
Yes, I have to say, you mentioned Game of Thrones. I mean, Game of Thrones has nothing on this. I feel particularly sorry. There's one poor man who crosses him who has written rude songs about Henry I. And actually, when I was learning about this man, Luc de la Barre, he's obviously charming and a bit naughty, not much more than that. But when Henry captures him, he decides to deprive him of his eyeballs and his genitals. And unsurprisingly, Luc de la Barre kills himself. He manages, I don't know how he quite managed it actually, because he beats his head against the wall of his cell until he manages to end his life. So that's one way out of a horrific end, but it's not much of a consolation. It must have been very painful indeed.
Oh, absolutely. And Henry didn't stop there, did he? Because even his own granddaughters were not safe, were they?
This is the one thing, when I say I like Henry I, this is the one point where I fundamentally veer away from him. So he lived by a very strict code. And I suppose a lot of it was done out of fear. He set examples. And he didn't really veer from them, even, as you say, when it came to his own family. And he set up one of his natural daughters, he set her up in a marriage and then made her and her husband swap children as hostages with a rival. And I'm afraid Henry I's daughter lost her temper with her boy hostage and had him blinded. And in return, Henry had to agree that his two young granddaughters would be blinded as well and have their noses cut off too, as the wrong party. So, I mean, unbelievably horrendous. But and I'm not defending it at all, but that was him. He had rules and he stuck by them.
Yeah, I mean, and it was brutal era, wasn't it? I mean, people look at that sort of stuff. And do you think that's one of the reasons? I mean, people don't talk about Henry I for a long time. It's off our syllabus, isn't it? But you, fortunately, have shone a spotlight on Henry I. Why do you think he's been excluded for so long?
Yes, well, it was very popular up until Victorian times to study Henry I, and then the Victorians took a very dim view. His private life was quite messy. He had 22 illegitimate children, which was thought rather excessive by the Victorians, and they didn't like he seemed to be avaricious, and he was clearly cruel by their standards. But I mean, I try and judge these people by the contemporary view, really, which is that you wanted a king who was good at looking after money, and you wanted one who provided law and order. And Henry I gets a tick in both those columns. And I think one of the other reasons he's been forgotten is that he was buried in Reading Abbey, which was his own creation, this enormous foundation, one of the great abbeys north of the Alps. But that's gone. First of all, Henry VIII closed it, and then Charles I in the Civil War blew it up. So there's no physical memorial to Henry I. And I believe, actually, he's probably buried under the extension of a school in Reading at the moment, which is not probably what he was intending.
I'm sure that was not his last dying wish, having eaten those eels. I want to be buried in a school yard somewhere. But it was extraordinary. I mean, you talk about 22 illegitimate children. The central characters of your novel, however, are the two legitimate children. And it's rather like putting your eggs in one basket, where you have the heir to the throne. Talk to me about that fateful time on the White Ship.
Well, I have to say, with Henry I, he had one legitimate son. And by this stage, the church was powerful, so illegitimate sons were not able to inherit. And you're quite right, it was all your eggs in one basket, because, people died very young. To give you an example, two of William the Conqueror's sons died in hunting accidents. Anyway, we get to this point exactly 900 years ago, and Henry I has finally won his great battles, 3.5 years of fighting against Louis the Fat of France, a man of significant girth. And he's now returning home, and he gets to Barfleur, which is, I'm sure lots of your viewers will have been to Barfleur. It's a very picturesque fishing village now, east of Cherbourg. But then it was the port for coming back to Southampton. And Henry I is coming back in triumph, having beaten the French. And a man comes forward and says, I was the captain of the flagship when your father, William the Conqueror, went in 1066 to conquer England. And now I demand the right to take you back in triumph to England. And Henry says, no, I've made my own arrangements, but I will give you my one legitimate son and various other children and relations, great generals and courtiers. They'll come on the White Ship, this fantastic vessel, which, as we sort of touched upon, was considered the sort of Titanic of its age. But then the big disaster is Henry I sets off across the channel for his 10 or 12-hour journey north, and the boy and his entourage get stuck into the wine. Unfortunately, they then dish it out among the crew. And although it's a calm night, the White Ship is going at full pace because the 50 veteran oarsmen want to overtake the king. And they hit this rock. It's still there, the Keyburf Rock. And they go down, and it's a terrible disaster with only one survivor, who is actually probably the lowliest passenger on board, a butcher called Barreau. And it is basically the end of the Norman dynasty, because the only other legitimate child is a princess called the Empress Matilda, Henry I's only legitimate daughter. But this is not a time when people will actually have a queen as their main ruler. It's just not possible.
Even though Henry himself tried, and he was briefly okay with his grandson, which we'll come on to. But you talk about Barrow the butcher, and you explain about why you think he survived, mainly because of what he was wearing. Tell me a bit about that.
Yes, I was trying to work out, why did this one man survive when all of the sort of high-born passengers didn't? Well, we know they were wearing silks and sort of wolfskin trim and things like that. Well, if you get into the water in that, you're going down. Barrow, this is a period when people really couldn't swim. It was not a pastime at all. But I think Barrow, we know he scrambled onto a piece of broken mast. And he was wearing a sort of goatskin tunic, the sort of offcuts of his butcher's trade. And I think, I'm not a scientist, but I had to look into this. So what happens is, even if you're in a wool tunic that is wet, it can still transmit heat back at you. And I think that's what kept him alive. I mean, he was barely alive when he was discovered the next morning by fishermen, but he's the only one who made it through the night.
Yeah, and I think you touch on an interesting point here, because the reality is it's what they call cold water shock, isn't it, which probably killed most of them. And the fact that Barrow, the butcher, had this warm outfit on meant that he didn't suffer like the rest of them.
Yes, I think we've all got in the sea or maybe a swimming pool or a shower, and you go, it catches your breath. Well, that can be fatal in cold water in the sea, because actually panic then sets in, and you can gulp down a lot of water before you sort of find your bearings. And yeah, as I say, with people not able to swim, I think, well, maybe we can say it as fortunate. I think a lot of them would have died very, very quickly, and then the others would have died of hypothermia if they hadn't drowned. So yes, lucky Barrow was wearing the right kit.
Lucky Barrow with the right kit. But there was also, I mean, it's fascinating reading about these things, because they really didn't understand the sea. And you talk about these sea creatures and the various things that live underneath, and you have these wonderful things. It might be a walrus, but they think it's going to be an elephant under the sea and that sort of stuff. Talk to me about those wonderful creatures and the misunderstanding of what the sea might contain.
Well, I was interested in this, and I actually devote a chapter to this, because the sea, to the medieval mind, was a place of enormous beauty, yes, but also huge danger. And you have to remember that people didn't know what was under the sea, of course. I mean, we were spoiled, whether it was Jacques Cousteau or David Attenborough who brought it to life for you. We know what's down there. They didn't. You know, they knew there were rocks. They knew there were animals, which, as you say, they didn't really know what they were. I mean, you see these depictions of sea wolves, sea lions, as in real lions under the water, mermaids and sirens on the rocks, or traditional ancient sort of dangers spiced up with what you see on the old maps, actually, even sea goats, which you wouldn't have thought were terrifying, but they were to them. And no, it's a fascinating thing that ignorance, I'm not blaming them, how could they have known? But through ignorance, the fear was even worse. And I think that would have multiplied the terror for the people thrown into the channel that night. How could they survive? Forget the cold, something was going to devour them. And then, of course, there was a religious aspect to this drowning thing, because it was very important to the Christian medieval mind to have absolution. And you're not getting that if you're screaming for your life and then going under. And there was an enormous trade, actually, among the few people in the fishing ports who could swim. They probably were used to retrieving nets or whatever. And they received huge payments from the relatives of the victims of the White Ship to go and look for their loved ones after they're drowned, because at least they wanted to give them a Christian burial. Well, very few of them were found, actually. And those that were, it was often quite a long time afterwards, and they were hard to identify. In fact, one of the king's natural children, one of his sons, who was discovered, was only recognized because he was a real peacock of a young man, and they recognized his clothes. His face had sadly gone.
Yeah, and you talk about religion. I mean, religion plays a huge part in the chronicles of that sort of. People actually document what happens, and they're always looking for a religious explanation. So you talk in the book about when the monks came to bless the ship so they avoid all these sea goats and these horrible creatures and things like that. And because everybody's drunk out of their minds, they shoo them away. And so when the chroniclers are trying to justify the actions, they say, well, it's probably because you shooed the monks away.
This is so right. You know, religion was the cornerstone of life. And in no way am I belittling religious belief, but the crossover between religion and superstition was very easy. And so when you couldn't understand things going on around you, then it was God's will. It was a very easy catch-all, really. And I think that at a time when God was not the Christian God that they believed in wasn't a sort of touchy-feely Gospels of the Apostles type of God. He was a vicious, vengeful Old Testament one. And he would smite you down if you did wrong. And you're quite right. You know, the sort of drunken oafs on board the royal ship who chased off the monks before the ship was blessed, they were held to account as bringing this about. And then you'll find, actually, interestingly, the prince who drowned, William Atheling, I mean, Atheling's rather like Prince of Wales, it's the designated heir. There's nothing, we don't know a lot about him. We know, actually, I think he was very handsome, although bizarrely, anyone of high birth who is described by the chroniclers is seen as the most beautiful or handsome person on earth. But he was possibly a good-looking blonde chap who was very popular and liked to dress up, etc. But the chroniclers, after he drowned, decided that he must have been touched by sin, whether directly or something one of his parents had done wrong, because that would make sense. Otherwise, why would God have taken this innocent 17-year-old to the next life, as it were? No. So, yeah, religion was always the thing they were trying to get into the story. And in fact, that's particularly the case because you have so many of the historians, as we would see them, they were actually monks as well, because they had the time and the means and the education to write these things down.
And I think what's interesting as well, Charles, is that sometimes it's don't let the truth get in the way of a good story, because if the monks had to find the justification, they've got to rubbish him, don't they, in a way? So maybe he is a bit peacockish, maybe he's a bit too arrogant, maybe he's got to do this, and this is why God chose to smite him down. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. And frankly, Andrew, who would want to be judged as their 17-year-old self? It's a bit tough, isn't it? Any adolescent is not the best manifestation of themselves.
Right.
And also, if you think about one of the acknowledged great kings of England, Henry V, he was famously trouble as a youth. So lucky for him, he won Agincourt, and that's what we remember, and not him messing around with Falstaff.
No, absolutely. Well, there are probably, 7 famous chroniclers. I think you'd have a look at that sort of stuff. So
that's right.
Talk to me. You're very good at doing the research. I know you do a lot of research. It takes you about 3 years to research the book. Talk to me about what you discovered from those 7 chroniclers. And did the reports vary?
Well, what I found was that there's quite a variety among these people, even though they're all men of religion. And one woman of religion, actually, but they're mainly men of religion, monks, either in Normandy or England. And, well, I don't think any of them ever met, but I do think there's one with the extraordinary name of Orderic Vitalis, who starts off life in northwest England and is then committed by his father, who's a priest, decides that his son's best hope of salvation, ultimate salvation, is to go and become a monk in Normandy. And he writes with such a vivid eye about this shipwreck. And he mentions Barrow the Butcher with particular reference to how long he lived after this, which was 20 years. And I'm pretty sure that the wonderfully named Orderic met Barrow the Butcher, because it's got the fingerprints of an eyewitness account on it. And others just saw it. Do you know what is interesting? Because there was, of course, a chance that Henry I would go on to have another child with somebody else. And he certainly tried, but he didn't manage in his second marriage to produce an heir. But I think what you have is this sort of unbelievable reaction to a tragedy of the King of England, and who was also the Duke of Normandy, loses his only legitimate son in a shipwreck. That was so enormous that they all covered it. It didn't matter what part of England or Normandy they came from. This was the lead story of the decade, you know.
And what's interesting as well is how you yourself came to tell the story, because you were invited to address a group of people at Leeds Castle. You've done your 17th century stuff, you're an expert on that. They were a group of experts, knew everything there was possible to know about kings and queens and all that glorious stuff. You came across this wonderful story. Tell me about that night when you were invited. I think you were even a stand-in for somebody else, weren't you?
I was a stand-in. I was a late filler-in. Somebody didn't go to speak, and it was look. There's no such thing as a free good review. And there was a lady called Alison Weir, who's a very good historian, and she had given me a lovely review once. And then she called me up and said, I've been let down and I need somebody to speak about the Queens of England, as you say, at Leeds Castle tonight. And I went, oh, okay. I was working out, it's about 4 hours from here. And I set off and I sat in Cafe Nero in Maidstone and put together a speech. And I thought, oh, this is going to be terrible because they all know probably more than me about Lady Jane Grey or Elizabeth I or whatever. So I thought I'd throw in a nearly queen, and that is somewhere we touched on earlier, Empress Matilda, who was Henry I's only legitimate daughter, who should have been queen. She was left as his successor, but it didn't happen. And I touched on the story of the White Ship, and I saw all these people who I thought would probably know the story, because I suppose we always assume people know what you know, and why should they? I realized they didn't know it. And then again, I was a stand-in. Always the bridesmaid, never the bride. And I pulled the same story out, and again, people did listen to the White Ship. It's such a dramatic tale. And the implications of it are still with us. In fact, day before yesterday, I went to St Bartholomew's Church next to St Bart's Hospital in London. And they are both direct descendants of the White Ship, because the one person who's out of a job when a court goes into mourning is the jester. And Henry I's jester was a man called Heir. And Heir realized he was not going to be required for a while Henry I was not looking for a joke. And he went to Rome on pilgrimage, got very ill with malaria, because Rome was quite a sort of a disease-ridden place back in the Middle Ages. And he was saved, he believed, by St. Bartholomew in a vision. And St. Bartholomew said, I will save you, but in return you have to build St. Bartholomew's Hospital and Church in Smithfield in London. So he managed to get Henry's permission to do that. And you think, out of this appalling tragedy, you've got St. Bart's Hospital, the oldest hospital in England, still in its same place and still active after 900 years. And that is because of the White Ship. It's incredible, because you look at the tragic elements of this story. And I rather love the fact that comes out of it. And also, the whole order of Trappist monks comes out of it, because one of the widowers loses his wife on the White Ship. He builds an oratory, a place of prayer in his wife's memory at La Trappe. And that is the birth of the Trappist movement. So it wasn't just a dynastically important moment in our history, losing the White Ship. Its ramifications live on now. It's extraordinary, really.
No, it is quite extraordinary. And I'll tell you what would be wonderful is if there were a movie made of it. Are you tempted to write a screenplay?
I've tried. I'm just not very good at it. I've read all the books, and I still can't do it. So I've been to Hollywood a few times to talk about my books, and I can tell them face to face the story, because I love telling stories. And then they go, "Oh, could you write it down?" And then I think that kills it dead, probably.
Well, but I'll tell you what, it is the storytelling. It's the art of telling a story. And it's all about teachers. And people have their inspirations, don't they, at school. You can find, if there's a particular teacher, I had a Latin teacher who was just brilliant at teaching Latin. So I love Latin. I went into classics. You might have another teacher who is maybe not as enthusiastic. In your dedication to the book, you say it's for Christopher Dixon, who was your teacher at Eton. Tell me about Christopher Dixon, because he's clearly an inspirational man.
Well, thank you. Yes, he's such an incredible, well, sadly he's no longer with us, but he was such an incredibly inspiring teacher. And he taught English, actually, not history. But what I loved was he was the least conventional Etonian master you could ever have met. He was a passionate aficionado of Clint Eastwood movies. And when he talked to us, he didn't really rate the books for the syllabus very much. So he took us off in all sorts of directions. And he set me an essay on concentration camp poetry. And I got really intrigued by it and wrote it. And then he made me copy it out on vellum, very Etonian this. And it's now in the school archives at Eton. But I mean, he made me believe that I could write, I guess, and made me think more broadly than I think would be normal among the Eton masterhood.
And I think that's one. It's sent up for good, they call it, don't they?
Yes, that's right. I love that. I mean, it should still be there. Who knows?
Oh, no, you must go and find it. I love this, because it's going to be part of the real challenge. Charles, it's been an absolute delight. I cannot recommend this enough for people who don't even like history. This is the best thriller out there. Christmas stockings have to be full of this fantastic publication. Charles, thank you so much for being my guest.
It's a great pleasure, Andrew. Thanks so much.
See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And I tell you what, this is superb. Do get your other special halves to get a copy for you in the same way as my wife got me this. It is wonderful. So thank you so much to Charles Spencer. That's Christmas Soul for everybody.